Hey there, I'm Armin Sinza at Exun, and I welcome you to the Exun Talks. Exun Talks are a series of interactive webinars and talks during the Exun Week. These are conducted by professionals across a truly dizzying array of topics and of different types, from game development to the future in automation. With a constant interaction, it is a fantastic experience for everyone involved. To know the date and timings for the upcoming Exun Talks, please check out exun.co/talks. Today with us, we have Mr. Jim Plaxco. Jim is a digital artist, creative coder, public speaker, and web consultant. Prior to entering the field of digital art, Jim was an information technology professional and software engineer, working for Fortune 100 companies like AT&T and IBM. Without further ado, here's Jim, sir.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Great to be here. You will bear with me while I get my computer set up to share my presentation with you. The subject of my talk this morning is how not to design a Martian economy. And it's based on my experiences from having been a member of a team of 14 folks who got together for the purpose of submitting an entry to the Mars Society's Mars City State Design Contest. In addition to the economics, I'll give you an overview of the issues that had to be dealt with and some of what we went through in designing our Martian civilization. And note that the opinions I express are not necessarily those of the National Space Society. So my story begins in February 2020 when the Mars Society announced its competition. This was their second contest of this nature. The first was a 2019 contest to design a Martian colony of 1,000 people. The story ends with our team's June 2020 contest submission, and this is the cover art for our submission to the contest. Now, the contest was structured with a set of expectations and guidelines and a point system that identified how submissions would be judged. These served as the main parameters in designing our Martian civilization. One parameter that I took exception to was the one that implied that Earth would be the only trading partner that Mars would have. Now, on the left of my slide is a table from the 1972 report, The Limits to Growth. That last column, exponential end year, that column identifies the year that Earth would run out of the associated resource. So we were projected to run out of gold in 1981, aluminum in 2003, and the other resources would be exhausted at years in between those two. Obviously, none of these predictions came true. But these predictions, combined with dire predictions about population growth that were popular at the same time, and a number of other Malthusian predictions, did get a lot of attention. And I tend to think that this may have led many to view the mining of extraterrestrial resources as being a way to escape Earth's resource limitations. Now, extraterrestrial mining, be it the moon or asteroids, it has become one of the economic rationales for space settlement. However, one must consider the transportation costs as a factor in the cost of any good that needs to be transported from where it's made to where it's consumed. Now, this quote from Jerry Kuczynski sums it up nicely. If you had gold bars stacked up on the moon, ready to go, you would lose money traveling to the moon, picking them up, and bringing them back to Earth. And that was at a time when gold was selling for more than $10,000 a pound. So any product made off of Earth is going to have to compete with similar products that are made right here on Earth. Take water as an example. Now, this number on the right here for ocean freight rates is a few years out of date, but I looked at what it would cost me to ship bulk water from New York to Cairo, Egypt. And with no discounts, I would have paid a list price of 18 cents a pound. This was at a time when the cost of delivering payload to low Earth orbit was on the order of $10,000 a pound. Now, one of the Mars Society's competition parameters said that the cost of shipping goods from Mars to Earth would be $200 a kilogram, which is just over $90 a pound. Now, that's significantly less than $10,000 a pound, but it's also significantly more than 18 cents a pound. Now, the counter argument that I made to my team was that it was unreasonable to assume that with 1 million people on Mars, there would not be a human settlement on the moon or human settlements on the moon, that there would not be space colonies, and that there would not be significant mining operations in the asteroid belt. So Mars is far more likely to succeed economically if it has multiple trading partners, because this makes for both a larger and a more diverse trading network in terms of both the quantity and the variety of goods being sold. So, for example, supporting 1 million people on Mars, Mars is going to have a lot of expertise in environmental control and life support systems. Now, that's not something that you're going to be selling back to the Earth, but it is a marketable product to anyone who is not living on Earth. So if you're on the moon, if you're in a space colony, an asteroid habitat, you are going to need those types of systems. Now, realizing that this was a complex undertaking, we broke the design problem down along the lines of the contest's grading system, and creating sub-teams that would each focus on one of the 4 areas, with a 5th team dedicated to writing the report. Another strategy we employed was to break the design problem down into different levels of detail. And I like this jar, rock, pebble, sand analogy. The jar represents the main constraints imposed on us, basically time and what human resources we had to work on the project. The rocks represent the main building blocks of our system. So from a technical side, it would be like, for example, answering the question of what are our primary energy sources going to be. The pebbles represent solution details that support and connect the top level design decisions. So with respect to energy, it would be a question like, okay, how are we going to blend together different energy sources? And how is that demand going to be met? What will be the demands on the energy system? Grains of sand were those details that were too small to bother with within the framework of the contest. And for us, the tricky part was distinguishing the rocks from the pebbles or the grains of sand. Now, approaching a design problem from a top-down perspective, we went about identifying the major system elements first, as well as the sources and sinks of resources, and the key system interdependencies. Now, as we fleshed out our analysis of the system's components, our diagrams became ever more complex as we identified more source, more sinks, more flows, more feedbacks. And as complex as this diagram may seem, it is a greatly oversimplified world model. Now, one of the first things we did was to establish a time frame. Just how long would it take to get 1 million people on Mars? And from that, we could tell at what point in time we were actually talking about with respect to when will we have 1 million people on Mars. For us, we settled on 83 years to reach our goal of 1 million residents. And that was using the parameters that are shown at the top of the screen. In doing this projection, the factors that I sought to balance were time frame, flight rate, system growth, and natural population growth. Now, Elon Musk had talked about having 1 million people on Mars by 2050, but I think our team was unanimous in agreeing that that was too optimistic of a prediction. And this is how we reached that 1 million people on Mars. This chart shows the cumulative number of passenger flights to Mars. It's interesting to note that of the 1 million people on Mars, only about 20% of them would have been born on Mars, which means that Mars is going to be heavily reliant on its being able to attract a continuous stream of new immigrants. Missing here is the cargo flight rate. We did not model how much mass would have to be imported from Earth, nor what that flight rate would be like. So the focus within this simulation was getting us to 1 million people on Mars. Now, NASA Ames has a nice trajectory calculator, and I used it to get some number on flights to Mars going out to 2040. Now, 3 things I want to point out about these charts. First, the pretty colors. Those different colors correspond to different delta V or total change in velocity requirements in order to make the individual trips. And you can think of delta V as the amount of energy required and as well the amount of fuel used to make that trip. So it should be obvious that trips will have distinctively different costs depending on the specifics of that particular launch window. The second thing to observe is that launch opportunities come at static intervals. The planets have to line up nicely in order to make a minimum energy transfer from Earth to Mars. Third, you can see that the trip times vary greatly, which really impacts the amount of consumables human missions to Mars will require. So all of these factors are highly negative. However, we can hope that we will develop high thrust nuclear rockets as they would substantially increase the number of launch opportunities while decreasing the average trip time. Now, with respect to transportation costs, there is a lot of stuff that people consume, whether personally or in the context of goods production. Now, on the left here is an interesting table that shows how much the average person consumes each year in terms of mineral resources. On the right is a NASA diagram showing how much air, water, and food the average person consumes in the average day. So it should be clear that for our Martians, the ability to maximize a local production of resources and recycling, it's going to be crucial to the sustainability of a Martian civilization. Now, recall that the contest outline said that shipping cargo to Mars would cost $500 per kilogram. So let's say someone on Mars has got a serious craving for milk. That $4 gallon of milk is going to have a shipping charge of $2,000 associated with it. So even with Mars Society's expectation that shipping costs from Mars to Earth, the reverse direction, would be only 200 per kilogram. I have to agree with Elon that the idea of mining Mars to export natural resources back to Earth is ill-conceived. Now, on the subject of transportation costs, while the Mars Society gave guidance on cargo costs, they said nothing about how much it would cost people to make the trip to Mars. Now, Musk had initially speculated that we could send people to Mars for $200,000 a person. He later raised this estimate up to $500,000 a person. So within this framework, I decided to put together a spreadsheet to see if those costs were optimistic, pessimistic, or realistic. So if you assume that we have an average weight person and the ticket price is $500,000 per person, you can decide or figure out what it actually costs them per kilogram if you simply take the weight of the person and assume that they're not carrying any personal baggage, and that 100% of the air and water is completely recycled with zero loss, and that they consume on average 1.8 kilograms of food for each of those days for that 595-day trip. You work that out, that works out to like about $400 per kilogram, which is lower than what the Mars Society was speculating that it would cost to ship bulk cargo from Mars to Earth. So obviously, if we take the Mars Society's numbers correctly, that would mean that we would seriously have to greatly increase the per person ticket price for settlers who are going to Mars. It will certainly be more than $500,000 a person. Now, given the need to live off the land, it makes sense to site population centers near the best sources of the resources we're going to need. Now, as you can see from this physiographic map of Mars, Mars has a lot of geological diversity, and that's a good thing because different geological processes result in the concentrations of various minerals and elements. So a key driver when it comes to siting habitats and mining centers, whatever, it's going to be the location of the enriched deposits that those civilizations will need to have mined in order to support their presence there. Because remember, they've got to minimize their dependence on Earth and maximize their independence from Earth. Now, obviously, water is going to be a key resource because of its multitude of uses. So cheap, easy access to water is a priority. But where is the water on Mars? This graphic shows the location of subsurface water ice, with the color indicating the distance below the surface where the ice starts. The particular paper from which this chart is pulled shows the area in the white rectangle as being an ideal location for accessing the subsurface ice on Mars. But just because there's a lot of water on Mars, it doesn't mean that water will not be in short supply. I like to use Camp Century as an analogy for lunar bases and Mars bases. Camp Century was a nuclear-powered city built under the Greenland ice sheet by the U.S. Army. And even though this city was surrounded by clean, fresh water in the form of snow and ice, water had to be strictly rationed because supply was not able to meet the demand. So finite resources means that you have to make difficult decisions. If you want to have more water, what will you give up to get that extra water? This graphic is from our design submission. It shows the final siting of our population centers and mining towns. It also shows the layout of a global transportation system. So one problem I have with this scenario is the presence of a global rail network, which I find hard to justify given that the population is only 1 million. But on the other hand, you have to be able to move natural resources and manufactured goods between population hubs. Still, an extensive distributed system like this, given the population, represents a high-cost solution. That means that substantial resources are going to be devoted to building and maintaining this expansive rail network, and that's going to contribute to high system costs. And obviously, if we're going to develop Mars, we are going to take advantage of the fact that we've got Phobos and Deimos there as well. This chart in the lower left was prepared by Lockheed Martin and weighs the pros and cons of the two moons in terms to Mars-centric operations. So operating on Phobos and Deimos and in Mars orbit were seen as being important given the expectation that there would be a high level of space-based activity with respect to zero-G manufacturing, servicing asteroid mining equipment, and processing raw materials that were mined from the asteroids and delivered to Mars orbit. Now, before going further, I'd like us to stop and think a little about what makes for a good economic system. The World Economic Forum produces an excellent report on global competitiveness, and each report discusses various aspects of the factors that they use to identify good economic systems. I would encourage people to do a search. The report is free. Give it a read. It does make for good reading. Another useful source of information is the World Bank's annual Doing Business report, which rates economies based on their regulatory environments, and specifically that environment's impact on the ability of businesses to form and operate. So as I go through the rest of my presentation, I'd like you to consider these questions, have them in the back of your mind with respect to the points I'll be making. And I would simply summarize these questions as into a single question that asks, will this policy make for a more or less sustainable Martian economy? One of the design areas that was called for in the competition was the aesthetic design aspect. Most of us really didn't have any interest in this. We spent very little time on it. But aesthetic decisions do impact the total costs of maintaining a Martian civilization. So I took exception to the guaranteed 35-hour work week with free time that was deliberately constructed to maximize individual freedom, which to me was something of an oxymoron. However, I did succeed in managing to convince the team that put this together to drop their requirement that every Martian had to exercise for so many hours every day. There was a lot of interest in the social, cultural, political governance aspect of the design. I was not a member of that team, but I was troubled by several aspects of their design. I, in particular, had a problem with the part that said that Mars would be ruled by a single government and that no independent settlement of Mars would be allowed. Uh, I also found myself scratching my head over the need for 20,000 judges in a system where there would be no incarceration. The worst that could happen was that if your crime was really heinous, you would be ostracized, but that would happen only after there had been a public vote of the citizens of Mars. I also had a real problem with their demographic plan, which called for every country to be exactly represented in the same proportions in which they are here on Earth. That struck me as totally unrealistic on the grounds that, one, if you look at the fraction of the Martian population that has advanced degrees, underdeveloped countries don't have the same fraction of population with those advanced degrees as would OECD nations. Two, in order to come to Mars, you have to have a job offer in hand, or you've received formal approval for a very specific business venture. And three, a person is expected to pay their way to get to Mars, which looks like it's going to certainly cost well over $500,000 per ticket. So thankfully, the folks who were working on this went back and adjusted their numbers a little bit. So that was just something I had a problem with. With respect to the technical design, there was a lot of interest, obviously, in working on the technical aspect of the design, and I had one foot in the technical design camp. It was the most challenging due to its complexity, as well as the need to coordinate with the economics team and make sure that we were on the same page with respect to identifying critical goods and services and in identifying what our export goods and services were going to be. And I already talked a little bit about the technical design aspect with respect to identification of resources, their location, and the transportation system. Now, one core area for the technical design was figuring out what it would take to feed our population. In creating this simulation, I wanted to make sure that the parameters for the solution space erred heavily on the side of caution, meaning that we were producing more food than we needed. What we have, and this represents the year 2127 when we reached 1 million people on Mars, we've got 118 square kilometers of pressurized growing area that's using 800 megawatt hours a day for lighting and over 2 billion liters of water a day for irrigation. And obviously, as the population grows, those quantities are going to grow along with it. Now, in setting up that simulation, I'm really indebted to this analysis that was done of the Mars 1 mission. It does make for excellent reading. And as I recall, there was a video up on YouTube of Bas Lansdorp, the guy behind Mars 1, debating with a couple of the guys from the MIT team that had written this analysis. And that debate only strengthened my confidence in the quality of their analysis, and that indeed the Mars 1 pioneers were all going to die because of the system imbalances that were present in the Mars 1 design. Another technical design component that was a big one is the water consumption. Um, Now, it's a major component when it comes to sizing the amount of resource that must be devoted to mining water, storing water, distributing water, and reclaiming water. Now, this analysis I did was only for agricultural and personal water use. We didn't make any attempts to model industrial use of water, which will also be very significant. Another key aspect of the technical design is energy demand and the ability to meet that demand. Again, industrial demand for energy was not modeled, so this aspect of our design was incomplete. However, it was clear that we would be heavily reliant on various forms of nuclear energy, with a bow to the potential for having commercial fusion energy as an option available to us. My summary of the technical design was that in our report, we had minimal technical information. This diagram that's on the screen here provides the only graphical overview of our technical design. So if I was a contest judge, I would have given us high marks for graphics, but poor marks for not having included more of the technical data that we were working with in our actual contest submission. But as you can see, a 45-page draft had to get whittled down to 20 pages. So a lot of things wound up on the cutting room floor. And now we come to the economic design component of the contest. And I also had one foot in the economic design camp. So, even though our team spent minimal effort on the aesthetic category and a lot of time on the design of the economy, I think our economic design was the biggest negative component to our submission. Now, the first thing we had to do was to identify markets for Martian products. And those markets for those products would have to be large enough and have sufficient annual growth to make a Martian export economy practical over the longer term. In other words, sustainable. Now, as I said previously, I took exception to the Mars Society's expectation that the only trading partner for Mars would be the Earth. And I argued successfully that our export economy should focus not on exporting to Earth, but on exporting to other space-based economies where Mars would probably have a comparative advantage over the Earth. So that exporting to other space-based systems would give us a competitive edge. Another edge we had was our proximity to the asteroid belt and near Mars objects. So a focus on support of asteroid mining was another advantage for Mars, particularly since Mars would be far more likely to be a consumer of asteroid resources than the Earth. So why ship construction materials from the Earth that we have a hard time getting on Mars itself when we could import them from the asteroid mining operations? And it was for that reason that we expended a fair amount of effort in identifying how our Martian economy could leverage the asteroid mining market, as well as offering asteroid tracking services and asteroid identification services, both for mining purposes and planetary protection purposes. So the benefits here are twofold. One, it offers Mars an alternative source of access to raw materials other than the Earth. And two, it represents a market to which Mars would have a far greater opportunity for successfully exporting goods and services. Now, one source of income for Mars that I actively discouraged was that of space tourism. Given the number of trip opportunities, the transit times, and the fixed and lengthy stay times, I don't see Mars as being able to materially benefit from space tourism. So tourism to Mars is not going to be so much a question of the money as it is going to be a question of time. I mean, how many people spend 6 months to reach their destination, 30 days at their destination, and then a year and a half returning home? It's just not a plausible scenario. With respect to trade with Earth, Mars would have to come up with products that were uniquely Martian and for which the transportation cost would not be a deciding factor in the product's pricing. Now, alternatively, it may be that 100 years from now, the state of production on Earth is such that Mars does have an absolute advantage in the cost of manufacturing to such an extent that the substantial transportation costs are overcome, but we could not count on that. Now, this product matrix I developed to help the team identify goods that could be manufactured on Mars, as well as to identify which markets would be most likely to be a source of demand for those goods. As you can see, Earth as an export market offers limited but potentially lucrative opportunities for us. And for those wanting to start a business on Mars, what I've done here is I've adapted Porter's model of competitive advantage to our Martian economy. And I include that quote again from Elon regarding Martian exports for the Earth. Now, if you look at each of the 5 areas of competitive advantage, you'll see that there's something that they all have in common, and that has to do with the question of governance and the regulatory framework that the business will be subject to. And that is critical as we move forward in this presentation. Because after I created the matrix, other parts of the team got together to decide which product or which industries would be state-owned monopolies, alternatively known as state-operated enterprises, which industries would be allowed to be privately owned, and those were the 2 categories. There's 3 categories here. The M's are ones for which no final determination had been made. But as you look through this chart, green is everything that is our industries that are allowed to be privately operated, hence competitive. But you'll see that for the most part, these industries are not core industries. Artisan goods, entertainment, Martian mineral water, Martian sample sets. Those are not mission critical industries. So I found the dominance of state-run monopolies completely at odds with the concept of designing an economy that would attract businesses and capital investment in Mars while leading the way in innovation. So it is well established in economic literature that state-owned enterprises are inefficient as compared to privately owned enterprises. Given the Martian environment, and the high cost of doing business there, businesses are going to need every efficiency edge that they can get. So I think having state-owned enterprises so dominant in the economy is a major roadblock to economic growth, economic innovation, economic efficiency. But it's just not the question of the state-owned enterprises. The Martian government would also be very actively involved in private enterprises, with every business having to turn over an equity stake to the Martian government, and the Martian government having to review the business plan and investment plans and give their approval for those plans. And another regulation that is that you would be leasing the land that you're building your business on, and your lease is not transferable. And whatever your original business plan said, well, you couldn't change your mind and decide to do something else. You would have to go back for approval. So this represents a very intrusive degree of oversight on the part of Martian government into what should otherwise be routine business operations. So when we look at what the Martian society is guaranteeing all people who live there, we have a society that's going to have a very high structural cost component. And that's going to raise the costs of all the products the system produces. Those higher costs make it less likely that Mars will find export markets for its goods. These structural costs are also going to consume capital that could have otherwise been dedicated to increasing Mars' productive capacity. Remember, we have limited capital resources. So for every decision that's made to increase expenditures in one area means you're going to decrease expenditures in another area. Now, one wild card in all this that we did not address was how much automation would be present in our Martian society. Traditionally, we split businesses' income between income from labor resources and income from capital resources. And automation is represented within the income from capital bucket. So the question is, how much can the benefits of automation be used to offset the cost of a poorly designed economic system? I would suggest not at all, since every other economic system in the solar system is also going to have access to the same levels of automation. Lastly, is the question of property rights. Universal agreement on the importance of secure private property rights when it comes to economic development. In fact, this is a frequent area of discussion with respect to the UN's Outer Space Treaty, and it was the abolition of private property rights by the UN Moon Treaty that was central to its failure to ever get ratified. So I really objected to the idea that there would be no private property rights on Mars. Not only that, but businesses leasing land had no guarantee that their leases would be renewed. So not mentioned here in my slide, excuse me, is the admonition that at the end of a land period of lease, you had to return the property to its original condition. That means that if you had built a factory on that land and you failed to get your lease renewed because the government had leased the land to someone else, you had to remove your factory. So think about it this way. Would you put up a building on land to which you only had a short-term lease with no guarantee you'd be able to renew that lease? And if your lease wasn't renewed, you'd have to dismantle the building. And so over the age of the United States Republic, our Congress has enacted a lot of legislation to encourage the settlement and development of the American West. And these are some of the more important bits of legislation. One thing every one of these pieces of legislation had in common was the use of property rights as being the key incentive in getting people to relocate to the frontier. And this is the sort of thing that we need for Mars to get people to relocate from Earth to Mars. So, our economic design left me with a strong sense that our Martian society would fail due to its being essentially a government-run economy. We have examples of such economies here on Earth, most notably Soviet Union, Castro's Cuba, and Communist China prior to its establishing of free market reforms and incentives. So I gave a very bad grade to our economic design. So that actually concludes my presentation. So I would just like to put in a plug for the National Space Society and the NSS Space Ambassadors Program and my own chapter, the Chicago Society for Space Studies. I will stop sharing my screen and take any questions that you may have for me. Okay, I see a question from Ashwin. How do you think the deep space economy will evolve once a Martian and cislunar economy has been sufficiently established? It will evolve. I don't see Earth as being a particularly good market for a space economy until quite a long period of time has elapsed, and we've had some real revolutions in transportation where we are able to dramatically reduce transportation costs. I would use as an analogy globalization. Globalization has been made possible in terms of transportation with a revolution in the shipping market, particularly the transoceanic shipping. When you look at the amount of goods that a cargo ship could move 70 years ago with the amount of goods that a cargo ship can move today, it is night and day. And that revolution in transportation has allowed transportation costs to drop to the point where it becomes a trivial factor in the final pricing of a good. And that's why I go to the grocery store today. I can get vegetables from all over the world because they're able to make it here because transportation costs have dropped. So I see the evolution of a space economy as being a co-evolution of sorts. As LEO gets built up, cislunar space will get built up, lunar surface will get built up. And if Elon Musk has his way, we actually will have people on Mars, living on Mars, working on Mars. So every bit of expansion makes success, that much more likely. But it is going to be quite challenging, and we'll have to avoid getting overly exuberant about it, as some are wont to in this field. So hopefully that answered your question on that topic. Are there any other questions? Your team gave an estimate of 83 years to get 1 million people on Mars. Could you explain the major differences between your method of estimation and that of Elon Musk? One thing had to do with even though we didn't model it, 1 million people on Mars is going to take a lot of resources. It's not just delivering the people to Mars, it's delivering initially all of the equipment that they're going to need to set up shop on Mars, all the finished structures that they'll need to live in from day one, all the mining equipment. That's a lot of mess. So I think Elon was assuming a very, very high flight rate. But I don't know that he's going to be able to get 1 million people in 50 years. I think that's being overly optimistic. And given the state of transportation, space transportation today, I think the $500,000 a person is overly optimistic. However, Elon has revolutionized the cost of getting payload to space. I happen to have been attending a space conference. I think it might have been 2004, and Elon was a speaker, and I attended his presentation. And they had I think it was maybe their first launch, and it was a failure. And overhearing conversations, people were very pessimistic about both Elon and SpaceX because he was coming in, he had no background. He was an internet entrepreneur. What did he know about rockets? But maybe it was that fresh way of thinking that is exactly what was needed. And so he has been very successful in driving down the costs of delivering payload to space. And we'll see how successful he is with Starship. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that his hopes and dreams are well-founded and become a reality one day. Another question. In order to divide the resources present on Mars, would it be feasible to follow the policy of free-for-all as on Antarctica, or marking territories for resources would be a better option? Well, actually, free-for-all, there is no free-for-all on Antarctica because it's not mined for resources. It's a purely scientific outpost. It really hasn't produced any economic benefits to anybody. The reason that you have multiple countries down there is because it's international territory, and as long as you have multiple countries present, there's not a great deal of fear that some one country may try to claim the entire continent for themselves. So marking of territories, call it mining claims, if you will be crucial, because those mining claims themselves, even though they're only a piece of paper, that piece of paper is giving you exclusive rights to that land, and that becomes an asset that you can take out a loan against, or that you can use for speculation purposes and sell for someone else. So, and you wouldn't be so much marking territories for resources, you would just be blocking out areas that you would leave it up to the acquiring parties whether they wanted to build pressurized structures there for one purpose or another, whether it was for research, uh, industrial activity, agricultural activity, habitation activity, or use it for mining. At this point, though, we still don't have enough insight into the resource, the population of Mars, particularly with respect to rich areas versus poorer areas. Because ideally, you want to mine areas that have the highest fraction of the thing it is that you're after, because moving all that mass, takes time and energy. So hopefully that answers your question. Another question. You mentioned that a Martian economy would be successful only if it had several business partners. No, not business partners, but competing private businesses. If you think about the way businesses compete, they see a business that is offering a product, and they can compete in several different ways. One way is they can figure out a way to more efficiently create that product, either by using fewer resources or increasing the process flow in terms of the manufacturing process. That allows them to lower their price, which forces the other business to adjust their way of doing things. Alternatively, they could come up with substitute products, a product that is the same but has additional functionality so that there's a qualitative difference to the product. So maybe the price is the same, but it does one or two things more. So it's the competition of business versus business versus business that's forcing each to innovate and find new products and find new, more efficient production methods. That's what I think Mars is really going to need if it's going to succeed, because it's already a very high cost operating environment. What is the rough assumed timeline for the development of the cislunar economy? You know what? I am not going to go there. In one of the presentations I give, I have headlines from 2017 claiming how asteroid mining would be a multi-trillion-dollar business venture by 2020. Well, it's now 2022, and it's not even a tens of dollars industry. So those people who were making those predictions, really, totally missed the boat on the call. So how things progress, I think, is really going to depend on there being visionaries out there who are willing to make the big gamble. We've got a few such visionaries in terms of Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Sir Richard Branson, who have been willing to put their own money into these ventures because they want to create something new, something novel. So I will not speculate, though, on how rapidly things progress, but I will say this, that the better the global health of the economy, the more likely it is you'll see more significant advances in the space economy. If we have a global recession or depression, that's going to retard growth of the space economy. Which will predate the Martian 1? Mars 1 is dead. So they're gone. I always had my doubts about that venture. So Mars 1 is gone. Next question. What would make a successful cislunar economy? adhering to good business practices is in terms of governance, as outlined in multiple reports by the World Bank and by the World Economic Forum. Can we take lessons from this proposal to predict what it would be like closer to Earth? Yes, you could. Actually, I could take my proposal and throw out all the Mars stuff and replace it with Moon stuff. The points are equally valid, whether it's the Moon, the Mars, or the surface of Mercury. But no one has really shown much interest in going there. So, and I will say that if you recall back to the one slide I had towards the end of the pioneers looking to the West, and that long list of different items of legislation, you will have seen it were two items in there talking about the Pacific Railroad. One was an 1862 act. Well, as it turns out, this was a public-private venture, but given the terms of the 1862 act, the railroads weren't able to convince investors to put money into the project. It was seen as being too risky. So Congress amended it in 1864 with a couple of provisions, one of which has to do with where you stand in line in terms of when this business goes bankrupt, who gets paid first, the private investors or government. And this 1864 law put private investors first in line, and that was sufficient to bring in the private investment dollars that the project needed. So that's something that has to be borne in mind. Suppose we discovered a new material on Mars that had no obvious use. Would it still be valuable? Initially, it would be very valuable to scientists, researchers, geologists, which is why in that Martian product matrix, one of the things I suggested was the selling of Mars rock sample kits, but that's going to have a limited shelf life in terms of, you do reach a point where you have market saturation. But anything that would be novel, if you take a look right now at the price of Martian meteorites, if you look up SNCC, they're called SNCCs, SNCs, and that's because of their three locations here on Earth from which they originally fell. I forget how much they are per gram, but the cost is significant, or the price is significant. So you could make money selling those here on Earth, but again, it's just like with mining metals from asteroids. If you suddenly double or triple the supply, the price is going to plunge. And so if you're Mars, you have to sell enough that you can make money at it, but not so many that you can no longer make money because your transportation costs are higher than what you can sell the stuff for. So biggest value would be if it could use it to make novel products. What is the level of development that will need to be reached before the transition from government control to private property control can take place? I think that's going to be a decision that the policymakers will make kind of on the fly. We've had an interesting peek at that with the Google Lunar X Prize. You might want to, do a search on that. And you had private teams that were working to send rovers to the moon. Now, according to the United Nations Outer Space Treaty, no nation can claim land on the moon. But NASA got into a bit of a tizzy about the fact that, oh my goodness, someone might drive their rover up to one of the Apollo landing sites, and we don't want that. So NASA declared like an exclusionary zone, which is basically a way of making a property claim on the moon. So I was really hoping that one of the foreign teams would succeed and drive up to one of the Apollo landers. Obviously, an American team wouldn't be able to do that because the American government would then never give them launch permission. But unfortunately, as it turned out, none of the teams did succeed before the contest's termination date. So I was very sad about that, because that would have been great, having a private group send a rover to the moon. That would have been a real first. Next question. What if a greedy business decides to reduce cost of their product by reducing quality instead of innovating? Well, the question is that quality, does the quality reduction make a difference to the person or business that is buying that product? Is it significant? That's the question that has to be answered. And by the same token, if you think of substitutability of goods, and you also have goods that are complementary, lowering the cost by lowering the quality could wind up in an increase of sales, because now other users who previously could not afford to purchase the good, they can now afford to purchase and use that good. So you could set off a virtuous cycle in that sense. And then it leads to competitors figuring out, okay, can we now get in on this business, or can we go in and offer a boutique higher quality good for those users who need that higher quality good? So that would be my response to that question. Thank you. That was a good question, actually. Next question.
Thank you, sir, for such an amazing talk. I hope you all enjoyed this session. Even more cool stuff on its way. See you at the next Exun talk.
Thank you, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone.